Good. So today, I think we'll go over some of the monitoring that we began talking about in the last session. I'm going to pull from a couple of different places. I'm in Ontario. I'm actually the ecoregion verifier as well, or the hub verifier. And so I'll be drawing a little bit on what we look at as far as ecological verification, because I've, as a land manager, as a grazer, I'm looking at the things in ecological monitoring that are extremely helpful to help me evaluate the outcomes of sort of the decisions we're making with the grazing plan. And we'll also talk about, so in order to do that, we'll sort of discuss the concept of the ecological states and transitions that we're in, typically here in Ontario. We'll talk about those leading indicators of ecological health, which help us sort of evaluate our decisions and make sure our outcomes are what we want them to be. So we'll use that sort of short-term monitoring example. And then we'll sort of review some of the animal indicators that we've talked about in the past as well, and talk about those. So let me switch my screen here. Okay, so the concept of ecological monitoring is sort of grounded in the basis that ecological progress or effectiveness really looks different depending on where in the world you are, the climatic zone that you're in, and sort of the native species, the native ecology that's in that ecoregion. And so the Savory Institute has they're piggybacking on this concept of ecoregions. Ecoregions are something that are already defined usually for other reasons that scientists use them for. And we are most of us are in one of two regions. So it's either so this 8.1.2 is described as a Lake Erie's lowland, or 8.1.1, which is the St. Lawrence Hudson lowland, is I believe what they call it. And so those are two very close nearby ecoregions. So there's probably a lot of overlap or similarities in these two ecoregions. And so we're going to be talking mainly about the Lake Erie lowland ecoregion, because that's the one I've prepared. So that's the one I'm in. So it makes sense to me. So the way that we are classifying these ecoregions are that it sort of starts with a very high level classification, eastern temperate forests. So that's a very large swath of eco regions in North America, and then it moves down to the next level, which is mixed wood plain, which then is what we're talking about is the Lake Erie lowland. And so that's sort of the higher level description of this ecoregion kind of gives you a bit of information about what we're looking at as sort of the ecoregion that we exist in. For this, we've sort of defined what designates this ecoregion, or what the characteristic of this ecoregion is. And so soils is one part of it, and there's plenty of variation, of course, in the ecoregion, and so that typically just gets described as where they've come from. So there's clay deposits, there's also sand deposits. We could further classify this ecoregion and break it up by soils if that was something that we wanted to do. but at this point, we're not saying that it's required. And then the climate is very similar, in these different areas. So talking about the warm summers, cool winters, of course, and then landforms, would typically tend to be generally flat or gently rolling. The escarpment is sort of a deviation from that, of course. And as far as vegetation goes, so there's a specific vegetation that's particular to these areas. There might be some differences between Lake Erie and the Hudson's St. Lawrence lowland when it comes to that. Maybe more Carolinian species in the Lake Erie lowland area compared to the rest, but typically oaks tend to be present, maples tend to be present as far as trees go, as well as white pine. Wildlife is, particular and similar from those different areas. So I don't want to necessarily go into all the details. This is what's required for definition of the ecoregion. We all kind of know where we're at, and it would probably be more interesting if we were comparing an ecoregion that we weren't so familiar with, some of those items, but I think everybody knows where they live. And so what that helps inform is this concept of ecological state. And so that we can kind of understand what it is we're talking about and sort of lay the context for this is actually where the ecosystem processes are the most effective. And so this is a diagram that sort of describes the states and transitions of the ecoregions. Now, sort of the way it's organized is that we have the highest functioning ecosystem at the top, and then descending in order of ecosystem processes, which we can kind of describe there. And so in order to do that, we've got savanna listed at the top, followed very closely by perennial grassland. And then below that would be a closed canopy forest, and similarly placed on the hierarchy would be a forb-dominated grassland. So a lot of possibly goldenrod and other forbs. And then a little bit lower again is a tree plantation. So it's common in our area to have tree plantations. Unfortunately, in my area, a lot of tree plantations planted ash, and so now they're just land covered with sticks. And then similarly a bluegrass dominated grassland. Something that goes there, and then at the bottom of the ecosystem processes is cropland. And so just as sort of a quick review, when we're talking about the ecosystem processes, we're talking about energy flow, water cycle, mineral cycle, and community dynamics or biodiversity. And so I'm not sure if you can see sort of those patterns, but you can, what you can basically see in those is the community dynamics or the biodiversity that's associated with them. And so increasing, one of the attributes of effective ecosystem processes is they're all related. And so if one's higher, then, the other ones could possibly be higher as well. Any questions about the concept of the states, the landform states?
Can you see if you can get those slides a little clearer? Everything's just a blur.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's going to be, I can zoom in, but okay. It might be blurry because of the internet transmission. Okay. No, I wish I could fix it. So just savanna sort of at the top, and then cropland sort of at the bottom, and then and that's sort of the transition in between as well. So the important part of outlining why we have these different states is because moving to a higher state or degeneration into a lower state has different transition paths depending on where you're at. So if you're trying to get to a savanna state, your transition to get to that savanna is going to be much different if you're starting with a cropland versus a closed canopy forest. And so we sort of define, we can sort of understand that, that transition is going to be different. And then, similarly, a forb dominated grassland will have a different transition to a savanna than would, and I'm actually missing a transition path here from this to the other. It's just too many arrows everywhere. But but that would have a different transition path to a savanna, of course. And because they have different transition paths, I guess the important thing, and this is what we're getting to, is you have different tools in the toolbox to help you get there. So where you might decide the process to get to a savanna from a forest, you might use a chainsaw if you've got a sort of time horizon that includes different tools. You could also start grazing that, and then but we'd have a much longer timeline to get to a savanna from that closed canopy forest. Same thing with perennial grassland. You might use different tools to get to that savanna state, and similarly from a tree plantation, you might use a different tool to get to where we're trying to get to. A bluegrass dominated grassland, is probably typically established with overgrazing, and so it might not be hard to transition to a perennial grassland if we use the tool of rest or recovery, the concept of animal impact and recovery to get it there. But using the same tool in a forb dominated grassland, rest and recovery, it would be a different use of that. Essentially, the difference between a forb dominated grassland and a bluegrass dominated grassland could typically be no animals in the forb dominated and too many animals, or too much overgrazing in a bluegrass dominated area, or ecological state.
Cory?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Ruth. Just looking at the importance of biodiversity, particularly in studies that have been done on grassland in terms of the impact. How do you translate that dominance versus diversity? So, you're describing it as a grass dominated in a particular grass, or a forb dominance. Would it be better to describe a level of biodiversity?
Yeah. So the reason we separate these out is because it's an indicator of application of a tool and a different tool. So it has sort of a different transition, and we going both ways. So we might move from a perennial grassland to a forb dominated grassland by reducing animal impact to nearly zero. So whereas that same transition doesn't occur, you don't get to a bluegrass dominated grassland by reducing animal impact to zero. You actually, it's by increasing animal impact to something that's not good. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
So these are within the context of how you're utilizing tools and looking at outcomes. I'm just trying to position it in terms of the evidence that biodiversity having a mix of forbs, legumes, and grasses provides the greatest opportunity for water infiltration and nutrient turnover.
Right. And yeah, I think I'm saying that, but maybe not well. Yeah. Okay, so to kind of illustrate that, I guess, what can I say about that? I think that's to some degree, I wonder whether there isn't an axis here that actually shows biodiversity increasing as we move up. I'm not sure. I haven't thought about it that way, Ruth, but I suspect it generally could be applied in that direction, to say that savannas are at the top because they have a very high level of biodiversity, and croplands are at the bottom because they have typically a low level of biodiversity. But those biodiversity isn't disconnected from mineral cycling, water cycling, and energy capture either. So I don't, so that's the only, I'd say it goes from ineffective to effective ecosystem processes generally.
Well, it's really funny to capture that, because I was just looking at one of Greg Judy's recent videos, and one of the comments, it had been a soybean field that had been transformed into grazing, and one of his colleagues that likes to go after him all the time just made the comment there wasn't enough trees. So while we may be grazing really well in the context of the tools and the animals we're using, it doesn't introduce other aspects of biodiversity, which is really critical.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And again, it really depends on the ecoregion. So you can see, so we're in a very non-brittle ecoregion or area, and we have plenty of precipitation, and so trees will do well. Whereas if you move to the west, and you show up in some of those more brittle environments, well, sagebrush is going to be as good as you can get, or something like that, right? Rather than you're not going to have red oak showing up in Colorado in the high plains. So that's right. So it is contextual, and that's, I guess, the point of ecoregions having different states and transitions. That's sort of the important thing. And Greg Judy may be in an area where there is it looks like from his videos it is a non-brittle environment, and there are plenty of trees. I have seen videos he's done where he's actually protecting trees in his pastures. So I think I think he understands that. It seems to me there's a lot of trees in his videos, if I recall properly.
Yeah, that's correct. He's in Missouri.
Right. So okay, so that's good. So yeah, I guess so. That's an excellent point. Is that's one of the things that I hope that we're making clear through the sessions, is that when we're evaluating the actions that other grazers take, and we're learning about what other grazers do, that we always sort of come back and understand what sort of brittleness that we're dealing with compared to the brittleness they're dealing with in their environments, as well as the rest of their context as well. So I think I was hearing you say that, Ruth, is that this is also contextual, right? Because we might have we might have a high use, like we might really desire in our context closed canopy forest, so that's good. But we also have to consider that, well, the humans living it, if humans are part of this context, the humans also have to get food somewhere. So when we say something about closed canopy forest and it's not a real great source of food for humans, then perhaps we're saying something about ecosystem processes in another area to grow the food that we need, or something like that. So it is contextual, and we do have some very interesting debates and discussions about, what is it? What is it? Shouldn't forests be up here at the top, because that's what Mother Nature does when we apply the tool of rest. It's interesting to hear people understand that rest is actually a tool. Some people don't recognize that, like our conservation authorities. they don't recognize that that's a tool. They call it conservation, but it's conservation by application of the tool of rest. In my view, we got lots of conservation authorities in our area that look like this forb-dominated grassland, and not so much like a savanna, perhaps. So, anyways, I digress. Any other questions just on that in particular? So what I want to move to is sort of how, hopefully help you understand why we're saying ecosystem processes are highest, in this savanna, perennial grassland, and even into the closed canopy forest, why those are the most effective ecosystem processes. So, and this is what indicates, this is going to be the end result of what we're talking about as far as the results of our grazing. So, let me, okay, so we end up, having this matrix that we create and we apply in ecological outcome verification. I'm going to use it in this context of, the discussion of planned grazing as just an indication to show there's a range available for us. And, as soon as we put numbers on them, it's more of a record keeping and trend analysis item for us rather than an indication of anything in particular. Sort of just to help us remember and compare year to year is essentially all we're doing with these numbers, and then saying, are we going in the right direction? Or are we going in the wrong direction? And so this is something that you might consider of how you monitor it in your pastures or after you graze, or, when from year to year, how you do that. So essentially there's 15 points. These are all leading indicators of ecological processes and the effectiveness. And then they, different indicators indicate different ecological processes. So the first one we talk about is live canopy abundance. And then, so the ecological processes that affects most greatly, because these are all, considered together, of course, they're all connected. But the ones that it applies most greatly to is energy flow and community dynamics. So if we go out and we take a look at a stand in the pasture, we're going to see a range of live canopy abundance there. Essentially what we're looking for is, if a raindrop falls or a ray of sun, comes to the earth, are we intercepting it? Are we slowing down that rainfall? Is that, are we capturing sunlight? Other indicators as well, and this is where community dynamic comes in, is that, live canopy abundance has a temporal, there's sort of three dimensions that we're considering is, the space, the area, and the density are all things that we're looking at that, as well as the time factor as well. So if we come back and it looks like this tomorrow, because we've grazed it intensively and not done a good job tramping perhaps, and, we've got other issues as well. The shape of the leaves, so the species diversity all have an impact on that. But essentially, we're talking about, capturing sunlight from all the angles that we have to capture it from different times of year. How that's being done well. The next one we're talking about is living organisms or evidence of living organisms. The microfauna are extremely hard to see, so we end up having to take a look for, indications that macrofauna are there feeding on microfauna perhaps. But we're looking for that, and sort of goes from, life signs are abundant and easy to find all the way down to next to no signs of microfauna. So, a pretty easy one where we're at, depending on the time of year, is, sign of worm castings. You can probably kick over any litter and find some stuff scurrying around. You can also, at different times of year, just hear it. There's crickets like crazy out in the pastures that we have to look after. And you can sort of see the difference from a cropland to a pasture just in how much life is out there as well. And so that microfauna is essentially, they're helping us convert the mineral, the litter and, digesting sort of the nutrients in the soil and doing all sorts of stuff like that for us. But that's, when we're talking about ecosystem processes, that's what they're mainly affecting is mineral cycle. Then we start getting into some of the community dynamics and energy flow items. And so these are the sort of the functional groups of the plants, sort of 1 through for. So in our ecoregion, so Lake Erie ecoregion, we don't include necessarily yet, and I'll tell you why later, the warm season grasses, because they tend not to be very common, although we would like them to be common. We haven't made those a separate leading indicator necessarily yet. But with all of these functional groups, we're talking about, the amount of floral stems and young plants in this group, and the plant showing vigor, and there's lots of green leaves, and it's relative. It's what we expect this time of year for the site, and for the particular year that we're talking about here. All the way down to, there's no reproductive stems. This is basically a species or a functional group on its way out, and so we want to kind of consider that as well. In these species, we'll also have a discussion, or we'll be looking for some key species. And so when we're talking about, we'll just go ahead and kind of take a look. So cold season or cool season grasses. So we want to see plenty of leaf. We want to see reproductive stems. So I'm not sure how well that shows up. It's an orchard grass. Reproductive stem growing in a fairly late summer pasture. And then we have some early season Timothy here showing up with, good flowering going on, lots of reproductive stems. So that's going to happen. And then over here, we got a horse pasture at the neighbors that, is lots of bare soil. These grasses are only barely holding on if they're there. There's not very many of them.
I've got some of those.
Do you?
My daughter just kills me. All these beautiful grasses, her paddocks are looking like that.
Right.
Drives me nuts.
Right. Yeah. So you know how much sunlight you're giving up. You know how much rain is probably running off the top of that, and not a lot of biodiversity going on. Some knapweed and some dandelions and some nasty stuff like that. But yeah, the key species in the cool season, so it's going to be different. It's contextual, but we tend to pick species that indicate our grazing is going in the right direction. So we wouldn't pick a species necessarily like bluegrass in the cool season grasses, because it's going to be fairly graze tolerant. It's going to be animal tolerant, where it might outcompete these other grasses that are more upright and tend to be grazed out sooner. So orchard grass, Timothy, brome grasses. We might have others, but those are pretty good indicators of good key indicator species that we want to be on the lookout for. So as we're doing our grazing, we might see those grasses declining or not doing as well. So we want to make sure they're present and we're not grazing those out. And if they're not present, that we are seeing them start to recover or show up in the stand. Yep. So and then the next functional group is forbs and legumes. So alfalfa, vetches, red clover, white clover also fits into that category, but again, white clover is sort of a graze tolerance species, and so red clover is a better indicator, perhaps, even though it's sort of biannual and not necessarily perennial. It could be an indicator species that it's becoming, reseeded or grazed properly. I'm going to keep an eye on that. Actually, it's one of the things I'm going to monitor this year in our stand is the red clover, making it to seed by the time I get in and graze, and sort of how that compares to the other key species that we want to monitor. So that's something to consider maybe for you as well. And then there's going to be like we got plantain, we've got what's this one called, chicory, and different species like that as well, which also fit into the forbs and legumes category. Thistle would be in the forbs and legumes category. Now, whether or not you consider it for one of the groups we talk about later, we'll see if that fits into that conversation or not. But yep, that's there as well. And then, so all of these things kind of show up in that range. Red clover, alfalfa, vetches, trefoil, all would be key species that we're looking for to be present in that functional group. Another functional group is actually trees and shrubs, and so this is, towards that savanna process. In what we're doing, we've got some spots that haven't been grazed that we're introducing cattle to, and so that's sort of creating some more opportunity for grass growth, and we might have to do some extra work with that, but in the top right here, we can see an area where we've been doing this for a few years, and you can kind of see the difference in the species from the neighbor's fence there, a lot of goldenrod, to our side where we're getting a lot more grasses and forbs and legumes show up actually for us. Even though it is highly shaded in that area, those grasses are starting to do better in that area. So sort of key species in the Lake Erie lowland. Again, this one might be a little more different the further north we go, but red oak, shagbark hickory, sugar maple, white pine would all sort of be key species in there. Now, trees and shrubs in a pasture setting certainly is something we want to consider how we provide enough recovery for those so that they're not overgrazed, perhaps, or we might actually want to implement another tool to kind of help us introduce those species depending on the context that we're dealing with, as in our grazing plan. Again, so some more sort of functional groups, about the biodiversity, sort of the community dynamics that go along with that. Two groups here specifically called contextually desirable rare species, and then contextually undesirable species. So this is where we get back to the warm season grasses. In the Lake Erie lowland, we're saying that these are rare desirable species, these warm season grasses, and so we kind of want to be on the lookout for that. So we've got big blue stem, we've got some little blue stem, there's Sidodes gamma grass, there's blue gamma grass, there's a number of them that are actually native to our ecoregions. It's just we haven't necessarily done a great job at maintaining them in our grazing systems, and so that's maybe an opportunity for a grazing plan to help us correct as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Desirable in the sense of what?
Desirable in that it's moving the ecological state in the right direction, I guess. That we're moving towards more effective ecosystem processes. So it would be an indicator that we're grazing with enough recovery for those species to show up. It also is desirable from an energy flow point of view. So if you can think of like the sort of summer slump that we experience, maybe that's mostly because we've grazed out these warm season grasses, and the cool season grasses don't do too well during that hot, humid summer weather, but maybe a warm season grass would. And so we're improving our energy flow, or energy capture, because we're growing vigorous grasses that thrive during that warm season.
So they're C4 and drought tolerant.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yep. Deeper rooted, so maybe they're also playing a role in the mineral cycle, bringing nutrients up from deeper levels. They're also able to obviously, this is kind of part of their charm, is that they're able to find moisture when moisture is not abundant at the surface, I guess.
So you're saying desirable in terms of the four eco-functions of soil.
Yeah.
Energy, biodiversity, community, nutrient cycling, and water. Okay.
What's beautiful and what the connection is certainly to grazing and the grazing plan and the financial plan is that, so if we can capture more energy, we do that by making feed essentially, so this, what we capture it with is photosynthetic material, converting this carbon to something that we can use. So we're actually making more feed, which essentially is turning sunlight into money for us. And so that's the connection with what it is we're planning here. That to me is the most impactful thing about why we want to try to promote, higher ecosystem function. I don't think there's anybody that can argue with that they don't want more feed, because that's what our job is to keep the animals fed, and make money doing it, arguably, and also feel good about it while we're doing it. So to me, it fits in a lot of people's context to understand this process and use this method of trending in the right direction of higher ecosystem process. If for nothing else, that they have more feed.
For free.
Yeah, for no extra work, actually. Yeah, absolutely. Just by planning, perhaps. That's possible that we could achieve this just with the planning. So that's what's so encouraging about it for me. Okay, and then contextually undesirable species. So here I've got listed, and I'd love to have more conversation about, thistles, burdock, goldenrod. I'm pretty set that goldenrod is a pretty good key species as an undesirable species, just because I know, you put a fence up and in the ditches, the goldenrod grows. Where the animals aren't, that's where the goldenrod grows. To me, that's an indicator that we got something going on as far as animal impact not being properly applied, in my mind. It seems so common. What about something like burdock or thistles? How do we view those as an indicator of, sort of a leading indicator of whether our grazing is going in the right direction or not going in the right direction, or our ecosystem processes in general are going in the right direction or not? Any ideas? Any other, is there any other species that we wonder about? Carrot is something that we always end up with a bit. Chicory is also something that some people see in their paddocks that they're not sure of.
Dock, especially for Jana's case.
Burley dock, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Burley dock.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm finding that I'm trying to eliminate some of these weeds either by cutting or, because I had a lot come up because we just planted.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm trying to look at them differently, like maybe burdock, if grazed early, could be a food source.
Mm-hmm.
Ragweed I have a lot of, and I'm also worried about them being poisonous. The sheep are not good for them.
Right.
I have lamb's ear, which I've heard different things. People say that it's not good it's poisonous or it's not.
Yeah.
Or
Yep.
It was hard to get a straight answer out of anybody.
Right. Yeah, I've heard similar things about even like mustards and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Rumex, I guess that's red root pigweed or something like that, I think. Is that right, Ruth?
That's dock.
Oh.
I'll look it up.
Yeah, okay. I do have a herbarium going somewhere on these things for all the Latin names. When we end up getting together with people from all over the planet, different ecoregions, we end up something I'm trying to get in the habit of is knowing the Latin names for all these species, because they call blue, there's like 19 different bluegrasses. So
yeah, Rumex is this whole family. It's dock.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yeah.
We talked.
That is not good for sheep.
Yeah. Right.
So in terms of thistles, in the organic field crop, mind frame, that thistle tends to show up because it's a perennial Canada thistle and sow thistle. And especially in the case of Canada thistle, it's considered an indicator of compaction. Mm-hmm. Because it is a patch plant and it spreads by rhizomes. There's a degradation in the soil that the thistle and associated soil microbiome is to try and heal that factor. Mm. So if you watch its characteristic, eventually the center of the thistle will die out, and that patch will eventually go away.
Because something's being treated or getting to an appropriate level that it doesn't thrive anymore.
So an indicator of a soil characteristic, biological or physical. And I think what Jana is learning is that it's not necessarily a nutrient factor. You can put lots of nutrient on it, but if you don't take out that physical compaction or the biological component, it doesn't get fixed.
Very cool. Yeah, I've seen. So it's interesting. I'll show you a video that I put together just of some of the long-term monitoring that we've done, which includes sort of the evaluation of these leading indicators as well. But just the water infiltration test is really telling. It's not that complicated, and it can give you a good idea of where we're at as far as that. I had a pretty big range of water infiltrations on different soil types, and well, not even different soil types, but different management practices, I'd say. And so that's super interesting to me. And it's just watching water go away or not, I guess, is the interesting part of that. I also did some soil probing, so for soil sampling for the long-term monitoring. And, there's soils that, you can get 30 centimeter probes pretty easy. And then there's other, and I actually attended to be in the croplands where I couldn't even get the probe in 10 centimeters. So that's a pretty good indicator that there's something going on with compaction there too. So.
Well, I don't know what you found in terms of various management and water infiltration and compaction. There's a lot of people that find it very counterintuitive. They think because a pasture or hay field is a perennial plant and it should have good, good soil aggregation and good water infiltration. Actually, in some of the comparative studies, we found grazing to be the lowest water infiltration, meaning it took a very long time to infiltrate. And they found that very counterintuitive. Like, how can that be? That there must be something wrong with how we're doing the tests.
Yeah, it's interesting. And there is all kinds of tests we could do for water infiltration, like lots of different ones. Some more rigorous than others, but some also more easily applied and less expensive as well. So, so it's a balancing act, right? On how we do
but
that.
I guess what it gets to is it's the level of management. Yeah. Even when you're calling it grazing, that creates a different outcome.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. They think it's all grazing is created equal. Obviously not. So, yeah. Cool. Anything else on undesirable species? There's going to be a few, I think, and this is probably where I'll change the more I see at other producers. This is probably going to be the one that's most easy for me to change my mind about. So it'll be interesting. So then, so then we get into sort of the litter. So we're talking about litter from 2 points of view. So litter, like fresh litter or mulching litter. So we'd say, we call that one, that's one type of litter. And then we're also looking at how the litter is incorporating or decomposing, or has contact with the soil. And so those different factors play different roles and different brittlenesses in what we're talking about. Like as soon as we get that litter in contact with the soil, because we're so non-brittle, so moist, that that stuff is going to be decomposing pretty readily. And so, there can be some pretty big ranges of litter that's laid down. We can have something up here in the top right where it was, very, very lots of live canopy that got laid down by animal impact, and can end up covering pretty well in the soils. This was reed canary grass, quite a lot of reed canary grass in this paddock, and so late in the season I find they tend not to graze. They don't like it very much, so they'll go eat everything in between and trample everything else down, it's okay. As long as it's getting in contact with the soil. And then we have, kind of like a horse pasture, or this was a dairy farm pasture that they had been in for 365 days, essentially. And they got, you get some bare ground showing up because of the pugging or something like that showing up there. Then the other part of the litter is that decomposing, how it decomposes. Like there should be a good transition in that litter through to, like a compost essentially on top of the soil. And this is where some of those worms and bugs will play a role in helping that process take place. Litter is probably the most controversial of the leading indicators, especially when we're talking about a variation of ecoregions. Because in a very brittle environment, any litter in particular is going to be a good thing, and it might not typically get around to decomposing right away. Whereas in a very non-brittle environment, you might say if you find a lot of mulching litter on the soil surface, that maybe something's going wrong. Because in a non-brittle environment, that stuff should be rotting readily, and maybe we shouldn't see large buildups of litter. And so this one's kind of, it's tough to talk about on a larger scale, but I think we'll probably be a little more, we'll understand a little better, in a sort of a regional context here. And then similarly, dung decomposition is something that we want to look at as well. And obviously, there's going to be enormous differences between brittle and non-brittle. In these non-brittle environments, they can have manure sort of on the soil surface for years. Like they might end up with 4-year-old dung sort of petrified or mummified on the soil surface and not really being incorporated into the soil at all. Whereas in Ontario, we probably don't have that same situation. It's probably, this would be probably bad enough, like springtime manure sort of laying on the soil surface until late summer or something. But surely by next year, most of that, if not all of that, will be disappeared. And when
Cory,
yeah, go ahead.
In your experience, have you observed a great deal of difference in dung decomposition based on Ivomec treated and non-Ivomec treated?
Yes, yeah, for sure. That's an excellent point. That could be a much different situation. Yeah, whether there's some treatment going on for the animals. We've stopped in our own context. We've stopped applying, general purpose applications of ivermectin. We will use it when, we'll actually test for, parasite loads or something in the animals, and hopefully call for parasite resistance, but we'll actually verify that it's needed before we do that. Or we might take a particularly susceptible class of animals, so like weaned calves or something like that coming off of pasture, and maybe just treat those animals. but not typically applying it. And there might be farms where this is an issue because the half-life on ivermectin's not great at all. It's like super long. It takes for that stuff to reduce. I'm not sure what that affects or what the reason for that, but it's persistent for sure. And then we end up talking about some more general things on directly on the surface of the soil. So looking again at bare ground. This is the bottom right here is sort of the typical horse paddock. I think that's the same picture, but bare ground. If you notice it, here we are, 4 of them end up in the scoring, and then we've got some partially related things to bare ground, so like live canopy abundance and so on. Bare soil is bad news, so in this context, we're saying in the ecological verification, bare soil affects a lot of the scores, and there's a lot of negative scores associated with bare soil. And so I'd say that is something that we're watching for as grazers, that bare soil is something we want to avoid or we want to be managing away from. And we want to apply that concept of keeping the soil covered and keeping armor on the soil. Gabe Brown talks about that a lot, and promoting, more plants growing to cover up that, improving, using our grazing planning as a tool to reseed if necessary, and replenish that seed bank, and then just making sure that we're allowing recovery for those young seedlings to show up. And then if, at the very least, if we don't have a plant or a canopy covering the soil, we want litter covering the soil so that we avoid access to that bare ground. So, imagine the raindrop coming from thousands and thousands of feet up. We want to slow it down before it hits that soil.
I just have one question with that, Cory. I have 2 spots that are my nemesis. I've tried different types of seed. I've tried everything, and the plants will start, and then they just die off and go brown in those spots. And I'm not sure why. Would I be good to maybe perhaps bale graze that area and see if adding something to it would be like the soils are a touch sandier than anywhere else, but it just literally I can't get anything to grow in those areas. And I know Ruth is like, come out and have a look at them. But you can see where stuff is grown and then it just dies. It never stays.
So another thing to look at would be maybe the species that are showing up there as well.
There's nothing will grow.
Is that right? Yeah.
It's bare.
Yeah.
Which is just, I can't figure it out.
Interesting.
And it's a significant area that, always that pasture is never, very good because I can't feed animals any amount of days on there and I don't want to stress it. But then I'm wondering if putting animals on it is the answer to try and increase what's going on there.
Yeah, and there's different techniques that you can use. Understanding the concept of using animal impact there to maybe if it's too bad you don't have anything growing there, but so maybe bale grazing is the way to get there. Maybe something I'd consider is even if it's not. You're not bale grazing in the winter, you could, if you have a summer slump that you need to do some feeding, maybe that's where you feed them is up on top of that hill. So you keep the animals out on the pasture. And
so instead of avoiding that area, you would try and put animals on that area. So I've been avoiding it. So.
Yeah. You wouldn't, during a summer slump, the reason I say summer slump is because that might be a good time because grasses would be growing slowly, therefore recovering slowly, therefore the grazing period could be increased. If grasses aren't growing at all in that area, then you don't have to worry about overgrazing them, right? So that's why winter works for that as well. But you have the added problem of saturated soils perhaps in the winter time to deal with. So that's we've used that in the past. If there was a summer slump and we need to do some feeding during the summer, instead of bringing them in and putting them on concrete and then hauling manure out, we just fed them out on those areas that we wanted to touch up with some nutrients or animal impact, or even hoof action can help that stuff to maybe infiltrate some more water. So there's lots of different reasons why you'd want animal impact there, I'd say.
Yeah, I'll try that.
Yeah. Capping is another thing. So this is one of the things I was just thinking of, Jana, is that maybe there's some capping going on. Sandy soils, the capping is going to look different. This is sort of a clay cap, where the soil has been, it's gotten wet. Either the rain has hit it or something, or animals have mucked it up, but they've created this cap. So now when rain actually hits this, it doesn't sink in at all. It might go down some of these cracks, but that capping stops that rainfall from being effective and stops it from getting into the soil. So it's, we're kind of euchred if we can't get the rain to go to the soil, so that grasses can grow, to get them covered up again. And so animal hooves can be extremely helpful in breaking up capping. And maybe, some situations, those horses might do a better job. Even a bigger animal might help break up some cap soils better than a sheep would even. So, so that's maybe there is a use for horses. But horses are very severe grazers as well. Something to keep in mind, just because they've got teeth on both sides of their mouth. So they graze pretty tight. Moss is also something, it's debatable whether we consider moss sort of a capping or bare ground situation. What is it exactly? It does offer some protection, but it's also indicating something's maybe not 100%. Moss really doesn't contribute to feeding animals very well. So I'd rather see grasses in the spot where we see mosses growing on the soil surface. Also, as I said, it might be an indication that animal impact is low in those areas, and so certainly there's some, that moss is creating some sort of competition or indicating something. I wonder what Ruth would say about mosses on soils in pastures or something. What sort of indicator that is?
It could be pH. It could be anaerobic, and just not having enough lively animal impact to create that.
Yep.
So we would often call it a sour soil. So
right. So we need more dandelions for more calcium, maybe. That's what we need. Seed some dandelions, maybe. Okay, good. So and then we look at signs of wind erosion. So we're basically looking for blowouts, depositions, that sort of process happening. Obviously, maybe more common in sandy soils. Also, we can look for sort of active pedestals where we've got, maybe a bunch grass or something growing and the wind is blowing the soil from around that. And so we get some pedestaling. And then wind erosion can also result in some litter movement as well, especially in brittle environments. I'm not sure how common it would be in a non-brittle environment, but that's going to be an issue for us. And then, I don't know, this kind of stuff. I see this kind of stuff out in Norfolk County a little more often in the sandy soils. They just kind of get up and get away. And then this is sort of a wintertime scene. There is actually snow drifts here covered in soil, but that's, obviously signs of wind erosion are not going to be good for the water cycle. It's going to hurt our mineral cycle because that's not, it's blown away. Essentially, it's showing up somewhere else, that litter, and not reincorporating into the soil. Similarly, we also look for signs of water erosion. This obviously may be more common in our ecoregion. Excuse me. So we're looking for active rills. We're looking for actively flowing water across the soil surface, and then even active gullies forming or gully formation. And this is something that, so there's the typical soybean field in Haldeman County every spring, sort of eroded, 1 foot by, 8 feet every year, which is crazy to me now that I know what I know. That's at least 10 inches down into the soil, that erosion. And then, they'll come over with their cultivator, and, after the cultivator goes, everything looks great again. Everything's nice and level. We also have, this is my neighbor's field, and I gain some of his land every year. So we've actually got ditches, which are now 2 ditches because the centers fill up with topsoil from my neighbor's place. And then we end up water flowing down both sides. So that kind of keeps flattening everything out. And then, so, even capping, not exactly a sign of water erosion, but it could, we could start seeing some signs of, material deposition in low spots, or, that kind of thing. And that might be related to the wind associated with that bare ground as well. And even in pastures, you can start to see, you can get gullies forming where there's a lot of, it's kind of an indication that we're not doing a good job infiltrating water into the soil, and then we end up getting a lot of surface flow. That surface flow congregates in low spots or concentration or key points, and then starts eroding even soils or pastures covered with perennial crops. So, and animal impact can do a great job rounding off those gullies, and then hopefully we can see animal impact, or animals as a tool helping that infiltration with the other items that we're working with in the pastures. Salt levels. Have you seen salt levels, Mike Buis? Do you see salination show up in our areas?
Not in my fields, but I have neighbors' fields that have some serious problems.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So, and it's just like Jenna describes. There's absolutely nothing will grow.
Yeah.
And he's trying to get different things to grow, and partway through the year, everything just browns up and dies. It's,
really? Yeah, because the salt situation is really like you've got more evaporation happening than infiltration, right? Like it's so that's something. The water's not going anywhere, and the sun's evaporating it to get the salt, and while it's dissolving salt out of the soil, I guess, or something.
And we corrected. He had about 4 or 5 different spots, and we put some loads of manure on it, and that seemed to help most of them. But we've never been back to the one spot again, and I expect that maybe if we cover it good with manure a few more times, we might be able to help it get going. But it's and of course it's right beside the road, so you look at it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, 5 tons an acre, right?
Yeah.
So that's cool. And so what's neat to think about there is that, what is actually happening to help that? I wonder whether it isn't you're actually feeding, the microfauna or the macrofauna, so the earthworms, and the earthworms are helping the infiltration, and that infiltration's helping wash the salt out or something like that, so it, like all these connections start to play a role, and then so once that salt's washed out, you get more growth. So it's interesting to think about what's actually happening there. Could also be fungus playing a role there as well. So mycorrhizal fungi, it's not something that we evaluate in the leading indicators, just because it's tough to sort of quantify that, and it is below the soil surface actually. But microfauna might lead us in the direction to say that we've got a functioning mycorrhizal fungi or something going on there to help with that as well.
It tends to be a little more common in Saskatchewan and places like that, and they've used like salt tolerant varieties of grasses and plants that handle that.
Right. Yeah.
And I think like anything else, if you if you have nothing and you get something to grow, then you start to build your soil health, and then you build your whole soil profile starts to come back, and then you get back to where you need to be.
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting for sure. That's to me is, there's a level of creativity that we can inject there. It's not all just best management practices, but understanding, some of these, and seeing the trending on these leading indicators can help us understand what's happening there. And that's why I think it's important to monitor this as grazers, because, we want to be able to, make some conclusion about, well, when we see an improvement, we know to some degree what actually changed in order to lead to that improvement, so that we can sort of use that learning in the future to maybe get to that point faster or something like that. So that's what's exciting about this for me, is that this isn't something they taught us in Plant Ag at University of Guelph, right? We talked about nitrogen applications and tissue sampling and stuff like that, but not necessarily the underlying leading processes that get us to where we want to go. Let's see, what can I
call that the moron principle.
Oh, yeah? Put more on? Or what?
Put more on. More nitrogen.
Yeah, that's right. So, and that, nitrogen fits into that mineral cycle conversation, right? Nitrogen is the most abundant, macronutrient that is available everywhere. So, but we, for some reason, feel like we got to add more. So there's actually, it's an interesting thing, in these circles of, regenerative agriculture or holistic management, we've actually got people starting to talk about, they actually don't want, they don't want legumes added into paddocks because we've got enough nitrogen. We just need to get it cycling. And actually putting nitrogen in the soil in some ecoregions or some areas where nitrogen is already, they've got too much, they don't actually want legumes putting more in the soil. So it's interesting in those contexts, they've gotten that far. New Zealand and Australia is in particular, they've got too much nitrogen. So.
Yeah, New Zealand, they have nitrate levels in their milk.
Oh, boo! Yeah.
But I guess when you listen to Alan Williams or Gabe Brown, they also talk about the legume proportion in the feed changing the actual flavor profile of the meat.
Right. Yep. Yeah, because it's going to have something to do with it for sure. And that's related to, we talked about monitoring the animal indicators as well, so you can see that, you can tell, I don't know, I when I see an animal that's overeating, high protein, which tends to be, protein and nitrogen go together, they don't feel good. Like, you can tell they don't feel good. They're kind of daunted out. You can tell they're not really, they're not happy when they're eating too much clover or too much alfalfa or something like that. So, so that's interesting. So yeah, so you would say that the meat from those animals might not be great at that point.
Well, I guess if you were reading the directions also for the grazing dairies, those things are even a lot more critical in terms of their health and their milk output.
Right. Yeah. Like that's interesting because, that's what I've said about beef production before. We've got such a lag time between when we feed an animal and what we see how that physiologically manifests in the quality of the meat or the quantity of the meat or something like that. Like there's a long lag. Whereas in milk, you get feedback tomorrow or the next day, perhaps, on what you're feeding these animals. And so that's super interesting. It's an interesting thing to think about. It'd be neat to incorporate that sort of feedback loop into grazing, I think.
So I have a question, Cory, and maybe we want to put it in the parking lot, or maybe you want to talk about it now. We're on free choice mineral packages for our cows. And as we go through the different paddocks, we find that certain paddocks, they don't eat any mineral at all. Is that an indicator that my nutritional levels are where they need to be in those paddocks? Or is that an indicator that something's out of whack somewhere?
Well, yeah,
or is it just a case of that's a certain time of year that they don't need whatever stage of gestation they're in? They maybe don't require as much mineral. But I haven't really nailed it down to, okay, from this day to this day they're not eating mineral. But it's a general trend that when they're in that part of the pasture, they don't eat as much mineral as they normally do.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I asked Jack about that last year, Mike, was do we need a different mineral for fast growth pastures and then slow growth pastures? Maybe better stated, there's a different mineral we need for high protein pastures and low protein pastures. Or maybe because what I think it is related to the calcium phosphorus ratio, Mike. Some mature grasses are going to be higher in calcium. And so, cattle, that could be an indication that cattle are seeking phosphorus or they've got not enough calcium or something. It's one of those things, I think.
Yeah, and so we feed just mineral. We don't add any salt options at all. So whether it's they're looking for the salt in the mineral in certain things or not,
could be sodium as well. Yeah, for sure. So one of the solutions to that I've seen is that, and so Greg Judy I think does that as well, is offers a buffet of supplements. So this. What we get in a premix, or what it sounds like you get in a premix as well as I do, they would separate out into its components. And so the idea is the animals will crave and seek out the thing that they need.
Yeah, I've seen that done before. Actually, our vet does that with her cows. Exactly, maybe 6 or 8 or 10 different things. And cows seem to just pick whatever ingredient they need at the time. So I would think the animal is maybe smart enough to figure out what it needs.
Or the animal is designed in a way that it has the senses required to find the thing that it needs, right? Like maybe it doesn't necessarily know it, but it's instinct. It's built in. It's designed into that animal to seek out certain things. They're much smarter. And so Ruth just put up here Dr. Fred Provenza. I saw him speak at a ecological farmers meeting, and that's amazing. The level of understanding he has about nutrients, and I forget what he called it. He had a specific way of phrasing it, but So Fred Provenza, I'm not sure his book is called Nourishment. Ruth, is that right?
Yeah, I'll look for a link and I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, no, and so Fred's talking about it even from the human point of view, other books too, like the Dorito effect is something that's really neat. So kind of related to that is that, there's something in us that makes us seek out like cheese because, cheese is good. But, when we go and we eat cheese, nacho Doritos, the body says, you haven't gotten cheese yet, keep eating. So that's why that whole bag of Doritos goes away. So.
Yeah, and we're finding right now that our mineral consumption has dropped right off, but they're eating the fresh growth of all the cover crops, right? So they're eating the fast-growing rye, and that could very well be why they backed off the mineral.
Yep. No, that's certainly an area that we want to improve for us as well. So so there might be some cross-pollination there on that one. Okay, so I'll just, I've got about let's see, so we got about 15 minutes. I'm going to first show you a video about water infiltration, I think I am. Yep. So I'll show you. So this is kind of just how we set up the water infiltration test. You'll have to verify for me that you can hear that, because I am assuming you can hear the audio explanation. Otherwise, I'll narrate it, I guess. Let me see. So maybe, Ruth, can you tell me if you can hear that? Okay, so now what we're doing.
Yes.
Okay, all right. And the level's okay?
I think so.
Seems to be. Okay.
Maybe you can make your video a bit wider.
Okay, I can try that. Is water infiltration test. So we do this at 4 different points on the outside of the long-term monitoring site, and what we have is a 6-inch ring that will fill with what is the equivalent of 1 inch of rain, so 25 millimeters of rain, which is 450 milliliters of water. And so we'll put that in twice. The first one is just to wet the soil, and the second time is the actual measurement. But water infiltration is really important to what we're trying to do here. We want all the water to leave where it was put by the rain. So we want it to leave via a plant rather than as running off or evaporating from the surface. So infiltration is an excellent measure of that. So what we're going to do is wet the soil first, and let's see if I can get you situated here. So we're going to fill up, put in 450 milliliters. So this is the first test. Okay, go Haley. And that's good. So that's 17 seconds for the first inch. That's really fast. And now, here we go. The second inch. Okay. Good. So 44 seconds for an inch of rain to infiltrate. That's a really good number, obviously. So we can see some soils take 20 minutes to infiltrate an inch of rain. So even at 20 minutes to infiltrate an inch, that's 3 inches an hour. That's a pretty heavy rain. And so this is we're sinking a lot of water into the soil, so we've got some pretty effective water cycling happening here, and so that's what we want to see.
Yay.
So that was super duper infiltration. We end up I was at sites, other sites there that weren't managed exactly the same, obviously, and I stopped counting at 20 minutes because it wasn't moving. And so just an amazing difference from site to site, even on the same farm. Obviously, you'll end up with differences from site to site. So again, with a leading indicator like that, we might actually say it's the trend that's important. It also gives you some idea where the different sites are, from inside of your farm, and maybe which ones need some work, and maybe helps explain some of the differences that you see in those other ecosystem processes as well. Sort of just looking at the pasture from a different window, where, Jana, you mentioned there's something that doesn't grow any grass, so you're looking at it from the point of view of energy flow, and then so maybe if you look at it from a window of water cycle, that gives you a different concept or a different idea of what it is, the symptom that's affecting that there. Obviously, if it's sinking water really well, that tells you maybe eliminates a couple of things. But if it doesn't infiltrate water very well, maybe that leads you down a different path altogether. So, and then the other, the other video that I've got, and we're starting to run out of time, was just about, the process and of looking through those 15 leading indicators in practicality on that site. In that site in particular, it was late in the season. It was the wrong time to be doing short-term monitoring, but it fit the context. We had time at that time of year, and we were out taking soil samples, so we thought we'd do the rest of it all at the same time. So we'll maybe just, if we have time, maybe next time or on next week, we'll take a look at that if folks are interested in seeing how that gets applied practically. And then I guess, the other thing I just wanted to kind of come back to a little bit was the discussion of sort of checking, as monitoring, the things that we can look for as far as animal performance. So we talked about this early on. We want to be looking at dung quality, the different levels of runniness, I guess. We're looking for something that's a little more optimal, sort of this way, as far as consistency that comes with that. But and something with too much fiber or too bound up or too solid, it's an indicator of maybe low protein, and then something too runny is maybe an indicator of too much protein, and that we want to do something about that. Room and fill was the other thing we talked about, as sort of a leading indicator of whether of animal performance as well. So a full room and at the same time every day, or for the majority of the herd at the same time every day, is a good indicator of things going in the right direction from the animal's point of view. And too empty is an indication that there's maybe some replanting required. The other things we want to take into effect is, some concept of water intake, whether that's easily achievable where you're at or not, might be a good leading indicator. You also want to check the electric fences, and those two, I've seen those two related as well. Electric fence is low and they're not drinking water. So that's kind of an indicator for me that we got electric fence in our water. So we need to do something about that. And that can certainly be a good indicator of low animal performance if they're not drinking any water. And then there's probably more in your contexts as well that are good indicators as well. Okay, so I'm just reading. So thanks for that, Mike. So Mike says the way you've set things up now, everything is very clear. So that's what we're trying for. I hope to sort of bring some more connection next week as well, as we kind of gather up all these loose twines that we've got, perhaps, and sort of start bringing them together. So I appreciate that. Thanks for that. But absolutely, these are all things that we're looking at. as well. So, and then other parts of these fundamentals that we spent time talking about already, and just want to maybe talk about again is stocking rate. So we want to look at this time and trampling effect, the animal impact that we're actually achieving because of what we're trying to achieve, and sort of the way that we monitor how we're achieving it as well. We also want to be looking at the recovery rates of these grasses. So while you're going through your grazing plan, we can be out there and looking at the pastures that we're moving out of, to get that indication of how severely are we grazing, that mixed with how full are the animals when we're moving them. That tells us something about, maybe the stocking density or the stocking rate that we have on that farm, and maybe there's something that needs to be adjusted either up or down. So if we're leaving a pasture and we're very lightly grazed, and animals are leaving full, but we're not maybe seeing enough litter on the soil for what we're trying to achieve in that, that says we could increase stocking rate in that situation. And the opposite also could happen, where they're leaving empty, they're severely grazing. That maybe has something to do with, that the stocking rate needs to be decreased. And so this monitoring is all going to help us do that. We can also go to, the paddock we're about to move into, and we're going to see, are these grasses fully recovered, and if it's going to be a couple days before you get that to that next paddock, you can say, okay, well, maybe in a couple days they'll be recovered. Or you say, oh boy, there's nowhere near recovery. And so that maybe indicates that there needs to be some replanting from that sort of monitoring. Grass growth is something that I also I'm going to do myself this year. I'm going to be recording that sort of on a probably a weekly basis, and I'll be using the grazing plan to sort of be able to facilitate that. So as well as precipitation levels, that we'll be able to do work on that. And so, I think for this year, I saw this from another holistic manager, that they actually used the bottom of their sheet to record, vertical bars, which were related to rainfall, and so they could see that sort of trending of rainfall, on different days through their season. So they might put some lines like that in order to sort of track rainfall through their year. I'd use a ruler if I was going to do that. But.
I think it might be easier to see, Cory, if you move from the PowerPoint camera.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I apologize. Yeah, no, I meant. Let's see. Stop presenting is what I need. I gotta find the button. Yeah. So yeah. Sorry. How's that, Ruth?
Good.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So we'll we're gonna monitor some of this with rainfall through the year as well. So that kind of an idea of rain that we're getting, and then so we also have in column 23 or row 23, we have an evaluation of growth rate. So that's where I'm going to monitor grass growth. So I'll kind of do that on a 5. It fits nicely in the book here, or in the grazing chart, if we do that every 5 days, because we've got sort of 5-day blocks in there. And then, supplemental feed is something else that we'll be recording as monitoring as we go through. Of course, we've talked about it before, but something that we'll end up doing. So we've gone through and we've plotted the planned grazing. So as we get through the plan, if there's a difference to what we actually did, so say it was 3 days later, we'll put in the marks 3 days later for the actual move that goes that's associated with that paddock. And so planning in pencil, and then and then actual in ink. I find that useful for reviewing, year over year to kind of help indicate, maybe the different start time or anything else that maybe we can use in the future to help us plan next year's grazing plan as well. So that was kind of as much as I wanted to cover today, minus the other video, but we might get to that later on. Was there anything in particular about monitoring or anything else that we wanted to cover right now?
I just wanted to share a little an observation piece when we're talking about soil fertility.
Mm-hmm, sure.
I don't have necessarily an overall confidence in soil fertility analysis as a great indicator in and of itself. It's good if there is a correction to be required, like a pH change.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike was asking earlier about whether or not to add compost.
Mm-hmm.
You can increase stocking density and overall carrying capacity without moving the soil fertility levels whatsoever.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that was kind of what I've been thinking about as well. In order to get to an answer for on Micah with that, was that in order for in holistic management and in the way I'm thinking, for that to be the lever that you're about to pull next, you would have to identify that as the weak link, the thing that gets you to better production, or production is essentially what we're talking about there. So you'd have to identify that as the thing that is the weakest. So the analogy of a weak link is that there's only one at any one time. So you don't talk about two weak links that we have to affect. There's only ever one weak link, and that you only improve or strengthen that weak link to the point that you identify a new weak link, and so I don't, so this, because a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and so you always want to be strengthening the chain by strengthening the weakest link at that time. So I think that's that's related to, I think, what Ruth just mentioned, isn't from that point of view. The other thing you need to consider as well is what's the gross margin or marginal reaction associated with whatever action that we're thinking about taking, whether it be applying inputs or applying labor or applying aeration or something like that. Is if you're going to spend $1,000, are you going to get $1,001 back? Hopefully, so that would be your gross margin is $1. But the other thing is there something else you could do with $1,000 or the time associated with that to make more than the output or the outcome of applying it to aeration or amendments to the soil? So that's and that's where this concept of holistic management sort of takes over. Well, it's renewed, I guess, in our minds that's what's important about it, and so financial planning again. So this is where the commercial comes in again for more holistic management training, perhaps in some of your context, is that financial planning becomes part of that decision-making process, and making sure that you don't have some other weak link or some other log jam stopping more results, more outcome, more reaction, more marginal reaction somewhere else in the place, because we're limited. We're human. We're limited. We don't have unlimited money, and we don't have unlimited time to spend on this stuff. So we should be selecting the thing that gets us the most bang for our buck, so to speak. Yeah, cool. So soil amendments is something that I like. This time of year is a really interesting time for me, driving past the neighbors' paddocks. I like during COVID we don't drive around as much as we used to, but I like seeing where everybody else is at, because I know which ones were kind of overgrazed last year, and I can, now is a good time. You can kind of see the level of greenness perhaps, or some other indicator, canopy abundance, or some other indicator that you can see from a further distance. You just drive past and you're like, oh yeah, that one was overgrazed, and look at the outcome right now, because it's pretty, during this recovery period in the spring, this is when it's obvious. Those outcomes are obvious. I see like nutrient response. I see that there's a piece of ground that we've been haying for a while, but the neighbor just let us graze cattle because they knew last year was a drought year, and we'd been bothering him to let us graze up around his house. I think he's thinking of too many flies. There's too many flies when cattle graze around the house. But anyways, the nutrient response, you can see every manure, like every spot where there's manure dropped in that pasture. So you get that polka dot effect of light green and dark green. And you can see the ground heap up, or the grass heap up with extra growth in those areas. So that's an indicator that there's some nutrient response. It would respond to a fertilizer application, but my impulse now is to do more grazing there. So, yeah. Anything else, folks? It's a few minutes after 3 here now. If not, my plan for next Tuesday is to do sort of a complete walkthrough of sort of a simple method, and then hopefully, help sort of tie that process and do it sort of more with more rhythm, I guess, than we haven't so far. But so hopefully that we'll see that as review is helpful, and sort of continuing to bring it all together. So if there's nothing else, we'll say thanks a lot, and we'll see you next week.
It's good. Thanks, Cory.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Cory. Next week.
See ya.